In this video, we talk about 10 questionable assumptions that people make about religion, scripture, and violence. Whether you're on social media, watching the news, or just listening to the neighbors talk next door, you'll encounter assumptions like these. Learning to recognize them can help you avoid making them yourself, and is a first step to developing a good response. So, here are 10 assumptions, which we also talk about more in other videos, and which you can practice recognizing and responding to using other resources on our website. Number 1. Religious people are more likely to be violent than other people. People often talk as if violence is only a problem that religious people have, as if everyone else in society is completely peaceful all the time. But is that really true? Are religious people actually more violent on average than anyone else? Number 2. The Quran is more likely to encourage violence than other religious texts. This is a very common assumption, but it rests on misunderstandings about the content of the Quran and the Bible, and lack of familiarity with the way that religious communities actually interact with their sacred texts. Which brings us to assumption number 3. The New Testament is all sunshine and strawberries. A lot of Christians think that while the Quran and the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible contain a lot of stuff about violence and judgment, the New Testament is only about love and peace. That's not actually true, though. The Quran and the Old Testament have a lot about love and peace, and the New Testament has plenty of judgment and violence. So, should the New Testament be banned? Not necessarily. Sometimes people talk as if the presence of violence in a scriptural text is likely to make religious people act violently. But that doesn't actually seem to be the case. Many religious people throughout the world read and love scriptures and don't act violently as a result. So scriptures don't seem to be as dangerous as some people think. Number 5. Many people assume that religious people who don't act violently are not taking their scriptures seriously. They think that if you took these scriptures seriously, you definitely would be violent. And if you're not, it's because you're either not serious about the scripture or have misunderstood it. But actually, many religious people take their scriptures very seriously and still don't act violently as a result of reading them. So why do people assume otherwise? Well, partly there's confusion about how scriptures work. It's often assumed that scriptures consist entirely of timeless instructions for how to live life, all of which religious people can or should apply directly to their own lives. Actually, however, both the Bible and the Quran contain lots of stuff that doesn't fit that description at all. They contain stories about things that happened hundreds or thousands of years ago. They contain poetry, accounts of dreams people had. If you actually read them, which many people don't, you might discover that they're not exactly what you thought they would be. Religious people often do draw lessons from scriptures for their own lives, but deciding how a text that talks about things that happened thousands of years ago should shape life today is often more complicated than you might think. And that brings us to assumption 7. People often think, this snippet of scripture looks problematic to me, so it definitely is problematic. People especially tend to think this about other people's scriptures, rather than their own. And they often forget to ask themselves whether their gut instinct is necessarily right. In every religious tradition, there's debate among scholars about how to interpret scriptural passages. So your gut instinct might tell you a passage is about one thing, but it could be that most other people actually understand it some other way, including most people from the religious tradition who consider that text sacred. And maybe the way they understand it, it wouldn't seem so problematic after all. Assumption number 8. In order to reduce violence, religious people should either avoid reading certain passages of Scripture or explicitly reject them. As we've seen, though, that is not actually necessary. Religious communities have lots of strategies for reading difficult passages of Scripture without acting violently as a result. And many strategies don't involve rejecting those passages. That is not to say, however, that scriptures are inherently safe. It's also problematic to assume that no one would ever use scriptures to justify violence. There are plenty of historical examples from the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions where people have done just that. So, asserting that scriptures or religions are inherently peaceful is just as problematic as claiming that they are inherently violent. And that brings us to assumption 10. People who talk about religion, scripture, and violence usually know what they're talking about. Lots of claims are made about religion, scripture, and violence on the internet and on the news and in conversation every day. And people can sound pretty confident. But that doesn't mean they know what they're talking about. So when you hear someone say something, don't assume that they're right, or that they're giving you the whole picture. Ask questions. Get a second opinion. Find out more. In this video, we heard 10 questionable assumptions that people make about religion, scripture, and violence. We talk more about these assumptions in other videos, and you can practice recognizing and responding to them using other resources on our website.